All right, everybody, welcome back for another Riftbound 101 episode. This week's schedule is a bit different. Because I had to set up some holiday stuff, as you might see in the background, and B, because instead of having two episodes this week, I'll be doing three. I had intended to do one over the weekend, but things got in the way. And so the idea is going to be to do a Victor in Focus episode for today, and to move the discussion about the metagame that was supposed to happen today to Wednesday, and then hopefully put out a video for Timo in Focus right before the Houston event that's this weekend. And largely this changes because I have a slight bit of time to do that this week, and because there's been like a pretty massive demand for Victor over other champions. So I figured this would be a good alteration to make to the episode format. So, like the other In Focus episodes, I'm going to be going over core concepts and key pieces, but instead of talking about one archetype, what I want to do with Victor is I want to talk about openness. And this is largely because Victor is truly one of the more flexible legends that we've gotten so far, and I think will be around the metagame in some fashion for a very long time, just by virtue of how efficient his ability is. And I'm going to provide you with a budget version, but then I'm going to talk about some of the luxury versions and current experimentation that we're seeing both in North America and China at a variety of different events. And yeah. So the core concept for Victor is really to utilize the Herald of the Arcane ability. So paying one, exhausting Victor during your turn only and during a neutral open state to play one recruit token. So you can't use this during showdowns or in response to anything or during an opponent's turn. So it is a fairly straightforward and predictable ability, but this effectively means that you will never not have an action on your turn, even if you don't draw a 2-drop unit, or if you're going second and you do have a 2-drop unit and you want to fill out your curve, you will do this. So Victor, basically aside from like a completely dead turn one opening hand, where you're the start player and you're missing out on one energy, will almost always eke out a little bit of value from those like one energy pockets that are left over throughout the game. And making recruits, usually you would imagine that it has to be for a deck that goes wide, but that's not necessarily the only thing that you can do with Victor, although it is a strong one. So I'm going to show you three main deck energy curves, and the reason why I'm going to do this is to like illustrate a little bit how there are many different kinds of Victor decks. So this is main deck curve A. This is from what I would consider a standard middle of the line Victor deck that really runs 3 Seal of Unity at 0, and then some smattering of units and spells across the board, but really concentrate on the 2-drop. So hyper aggressive with some finishers and some plays throughout. And a good mix of combat tricks and removal. Main deck curve B is a deck that's been going around the circuit these past 2 weeks, loosely referred to as Miracle Victor, although that's not the name of the deck I'll be showcasing. And this one actually runs more seals, a lot more spells, very different creatures, and it runs 2 of Time Warp at the 10 cost. And so this deck is actually much slower and will tend to try to outvalue opponents more than use aggression. So these are like 2 very different concepts for Victor, and this deck doesn't even use the same Victor champion unit. And then main deck curve C, which is the version of Victor that appeals to me the most, and I'm playing something in Darius that looks kind of like this. This effectively has no units above 5 mana, and it will run a fair amount of... Oh, I actually messed this up. It's supposed to have some 3-cost gear in there, but it will run mostly 0-cost gear and a little bit of 3-cost gear. This is like a mistaken curve, but you get the point. It doesn't really go up to 7. It definitely doesn't go up to 10, and it really has a high concentration of units between 2 and 5 almost exclusively. The 6s are, if I'm not mistaken, Grand Stratagems. So 3 different looks at Victor, 3 entirely different ways of playing it, but not always of building. So when you're playing Victor, one of the things that I think is generally true in all three states of the deck is that you want to play proactively to the board small units, so either your one drops or small two drops, and you want to get them in battlefields and sort of force your opponent to just come in and clean them up, at which point you can either give up on that battlefield, you can use removal, or you can just try to overpower them if you have enough of a board presence there. The other thing that's true of all three Victor archetypes, and it will be true of every Victor deck forever, is that Victor is the only deck that has an infinite amount of one drops. Not at the same time, but you will always have that one drop play, and you can play units to battlefields that you were holding, so you can sort of like fortify if you do want to. Although my personal sense and what I've seen players do is really play units to base and then only commit what is necessary for conquers. You have about 11 payoffs within that, and the pieces of stun interaction are just interaction. It should be removal or interaction. And then you can smooth out that curve and really take advantage of the fact that Victor is one of the few heroes that doesn't absolutely hate going second. It's still like not an advantageous start point unless you are maybe an Aurora deck running the battlefield that ramps you by 1 so you can immediately catalyst. But more often than not, decks really want to go first, and Victor would like to as well, but will fare less poorly in the matchups where he has to go second than other decks do. So the name of the game with Victor is really versatility, right? You can really be flexible in your plays, in your hands, and what you're doing throughout. The key pieces that you're going to see a lot of, and you're not going to see all of them in every version of the deck, but you're likely to see some of these across your research and when you see people bring these decks at Nexus Nights or the skirmish events that are starting up pretty soon. So you're going to see token engines, so you're going to see other kinds of units that make recruits, and in Spirit Forge there is a gear that is 7 energy and will make 3 recruits as well, so that's probably going to factor in some decks with Heimerdinger when that comes around. And because you have so many small tokens, there are some key pieces of symmetrical or asymmetrical removal. And symmetrical in the sense of like, we each have to, if I cast the spell, we each have to sacrifice a unit. Or if I use a certain battlefield that would be advantageous if we had the same number of units, I actually get more out of it because I have more units than you. So Victor makes use of those kinds of effects. And then there's some specific go wide payoffs, which are multiplying small buffs, or when I say buffs, I mean might increases across the board, or even some pretty big ones that only Victor and some builds of Darius get to really make use of in full. So the token generators. These I think are not super controversial. You have 2 kinds generally. You have the unconditional and the conditional ones. So Victor himself is an unconditional token maker. You just get to make one every turn. And things like Faithful Manufacturer, which costs 3 and has 2 might and makes a token, are also super useful. Then you have your conditional ones. And the conditional ones tend to vary by unit build, with the exception of Vanguard Captain, played in every version of this deck I've seen so far in 3-ofs. So Vanguard Captain, you have to play it second because you want to trigger Legion, but if you can trigger Legion, you effectively get 5 power out of 3 energy, which is very efficient. And then cards like Machine Herald, 4 might for 5 power, but Death Knell, it gives you 3 units. And I'm sure somebody's going to break this with Karthus, the yellow rare that doubles Death Knell effects at some point in the future. We're just not there yet, but I'm holding a set of Karthus for when that happens. And I like Machine Herald in a very specific version of Victor that I'm going to talk about later in the video. So you kind of want some amount of these. Generally, you want 3 of Faithful Manufacturer, 3 of Vanguard Captain, and then the rest will vary, but you're looking at Machine Herald. Some versions run Noxian. I think it's the Noxian War Drummer, which makes a token when it moves. And then there are some other ways of making tokens that are not as like straightforward on a single card, and I'll talk about them when I get to that specific deck type. For the asymmetrical removal, the 2 that are really run, I think, almost in every version of Victor and would highly recommend in 3-ofs are Call the Weak and Hidden Blade. Now, Call the Weak is super interesting in general, but in Victor effectively has no downside. You will always pay 2 energy and 1 order rune and sacrifice a recruit, and you're going to force your opponent to sacrifice presumably their weakest unit. This is especially brutal in slower versions of Aurora, in certain matchups where Yi can't get Zhonya's down, in Yasuo decks. Sure, it can be countered, as can many effects, but I would argue that it's incredibly efficient. The only time you don't want to use it is if your opponent's sitting on a advantageous death knell effects like Soaring Scout or Watchful Sentry, or if they're also on recruits. So if you're in a mirror match, Call the Weak becomes much less attractive as a spell, and there are other things you can side for it. I think in general you're siding in like more grand stratagems if you're in that mirror. Hidden Blade. Viktor gets to actually use this much more than other heroes do. I actually have a comment on the Leona video from last week asking, why don't you run Hidden Blade in the budget version of Leona, or why have you made that choice? And my answer is, Hidden Blade becomes much more useful when you have shitty units that you're happy sacrificing to its own effect to draw 2, and there's no better hero for it than Viktor. Darius likes using it too, and then the other yellow legends like it a little bit less because they actually value their units a little bit more. Now, obviously, you can use it, and I think there are going to be Leona decks or maybe set decks as well that use it. It's just not as much of an auto include as it is here. Imperial Decree is sort of a shadow board wipe, so you can use it on showdowns. And I think there's a little bit of a learning curve with this because the way it works is it turns any incidental damage into a kill effect. So you play it for 5 and 2 order runes, and all of your recruit tokens all of a sudden can kill 8, 9, 10 might units, which is really devastating for late game decks that are utilizing high power creatures. And for example, this like destroys cards like Deadbloom Predator because it doesn't target them directly. It targets your own units, or actually the sort of board state generally. Now, moving all of your units into a battlefield and using Imperial Decree is actually a very incorrect way of playing because you're going to have to assign sequential damage, and there's some issues with how you can assign that damage, which, if, for example, you're dealing with tank units, means that you're not going to get the maximal effect out of it. So I think Imperial Decree, more often than not, is either going to be used as an action defensively when you really just want to kill 1 or 2 units, or you're going to utilize it by stocking a lot of recruits in your base, playing Imperial Decree before you go to a showdown, and then individually going to consecutive showdowns with 1 recruit at a time, killing 1 unit every time you go in, which I think is a fantastic play. And then Facebreaker is another symmetrical piece of removal where you will stun your recruit for their biggest thing, and this will be useful in matchups, for example, where somebody has a boosted, like a White Flame Protector boosted unit, and you can really just like punish them for stacking a lot of value on 1 card. It's also reasonably good against Set, which because it's not a damage piece of removal, and this deck in general I think fares fairly well into Set where red decks don't. So these are sort of your suite. I think you're generally going to see 3 Call the Weak, 3 Hidden Blade, 1 to 3 Facebreaker, and Imperial Decrees varies on which version of the deck you're running. And then the the seal in the room that we have to talk about. So Seal of Unity has rapidly become one of the more expensive cards, and it is truly at home in Viktor decks and in Hook decks. And there is a Hook Viktor deck, meaning that virtually every version of Viktor that you're going to see in competitive play is going to be running a full set of Seal of Unity. Yellow cards are generally, the ones that are played anyways, are very order rune intensive, and you're going to get a lot of value out of Seal of Unity. It also activates Vanguard Captain on turn 1 if you're going second, and if you're in Darius, actually, if you're going first. So you can, for example, exhaust a rune to add one rune power or rune energy, and then you can play Seal of Unity, you recycle that order rune, and then you can pay 3, including the one that you just floated, to play Vanguard Captain and get 3 units. So 5 on turn 1, which insulates you from, like most opening hands from other players, as well as Call the Weak. It has like a lot of benefits. And then you just get value from there. Most lists really have between 12 and 21 cards that scale with Seal of Unity, and it also pays for Yellow Victor's order cost. It's really hard to not include this card in Victor decks. I played for about 2 weeks without it, and I can tell you, you will just run out of gas at some point if you are churning through your yellow runes. And there really is no way around this right now. It's like the inverse effect of why Kaisa is so good with certain spell counts, because you can just never have to run runes, even though her champion spell and other cards are expensive. So it's an issue. And Seal of Unity, for my money, is even stronger in certain Darius decks. So if you're in yellow and you're likely to play either Victor or Darius or Hook, it's a good investment. It is just really expensive right now. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's an unfortunate moment in the meta. Your payoffs, and hang on to your hat in terms of order and costs. So Grand Stratagem is really like a at home in Victor and in certain Darius decks, and it is a terrifying card. It's 6 energy, 3 order runes, +5 to all units. It's only these go wide decks that can really eke out like 20 to 30 power out of it, and an opponent sitting on 6 open energy when you're against a Victor or Darius is like truly a terrifying board state to be facing down. It almost always means that they can hold a battlefield better than virtually any other deck. Grand Stratagem plows through Aurora decks. It prevents blowouts by Cathian Rain. It just kind of does everything so long as you can play it, and it's really good here. The only sort of counter to it is green counter magic and things like Mystic Reversal. So, keep an eye out for that, but generally this is going to be one of the marquee cards you're going to see. Victor Leader is the other sort of constant piece in this deck that I really like. Turns all of your units that die that aren't recruits into recruits, so you just get more value over time, and I think plays well to like the mid-rangey version, but even in the aggressive version of the deck, you're going to be happy to trade off your mid-sized units and get more recruits out of it. And then this deck actually gets to play Yellow Darius, which you can sort of do a like seal into Darius or small 2-cost unit into Darius play, and all of a sudden have like 6 power Darius with Legion enter ready and give +1 to your effects. He's like a mobile Trifarian war camp, and I like him a lot. He's not played in any of the lists I'm going to show you today, but consider him as a sort of budget option, for example, to Watcher if you would like. And then Trifarian War Camp. Trifarian War Camp is played by a lot of decks to sort of get out of removal range. In Victor and in Go Wide Darius, it's actually played because you can just use it better than any other heroes. You will always, or almost always, have way more units than your opponent. So for example, if you're playing against an Aurora deck and they sit a Volley Bear here, they're getting 1 power out of it, and you can go in with 6 or 7 units and get like 7 power. It's really strong, and it will also push some of your units out of range for specific removal. So keep that in mind. These, I think, are always good. This also means that your Trifarian War Camp match is going to feel a lot better probably than your other two, and you should be cognizant of that. The other fields you can run are going to vary a lot in terms of how you build your Victor. And so I think 2 that you're going to see a lot are Arena's Greatest if you're playing the super aggressive version, just because there's 1 less point to score. And Vile Maws is going to punish other Conquer decks because you don't really care about sitting 1 recruit into a battlefield and then losing it. But if your opponent has to commit a Darius or a Kaisa and cannot like really get them back out of there, then it's going to be a big problem. And Victor and Go Wide Darius are really the only 2 heroes that I would ever consider running Grand Plaza. It's kind of a meme, but it has won me Nexus Knights in the past, and it really is surprising when you can catch an opponent off guard. Grand Plaza is more of a tech battlefield against the Aurora decks, mostly, because it really punishes passive play. And if your opponent's not running board wipes, or if, for example, if they're running MF Aurora and they're not on bullet time, you can kind of just win very early, very quickly, right? If you've got that opening 3-unit play, and then on turn 2 you conquer and you dump another two like manufacturers in there, or a manufacturer in Victor's ability, you can very quickly get to the point where you can hold this. But really, what you're threatening is that you will get that point, which will often force opponents to take some engagements that they might not otherwise take. You shouldn't expect to win with this battlefield often, and it is certainly your like third in terms of power, even in the decks that you will run it in. For my money. Okay, so matchups. Again, because Victor is so variable, they're gonna have very, you know, different kinds of matchups. But I will say, in my experience, the Kaisa and Annie matchups are reasonably hard. The go wide version in particular kind of gets hammered by Kaisa, and things like Acathian Rain can really just like destroy your board. And if you're not on card draw, it's going to feel terrible. Aurora, on the other hand, just collapses against this deck. I don't think I've lost a single Nexus Knight match. I think it's been like straight 2-0s. You're super aggressive on battlefields, even when you're playing the control version, and they're often stuck ramping or doing other stuff, which you're happy to sort of beat them to the punch. Annie is developing in the metagame right now, and I'm pretty sure, based on the matchups that I've had, that Annie has a favorable matchup into Victor. Vi recycling a bunch of cards into Ride the Wind can just kind of collapse your battlefields, and they do have access to Tibbers, depending on the version which they're playing, which if you run into that version of Annie, you're going to feel it for sure, because it's going to board wipe you. And so I would be careful in these matchups, and I would treat them with a degree of skepticism. But there is the hook variant of Victor, which I think has a more complicated but not necessarily unfavorable matchup. If they kill your units before you can hook them, then it's really bad. But a lot of the units they use in hook have death knells, or you have ways of reanimating them, so it doesn't feel as terrible, and you can get value over them in the end. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So part of the discussion about openness when we're talking about Victor is that there are different speeds to play Victor, and there are different styles within the speeds. So you can build Victor fast or medium speed to moderately slow. I wouldn't say that this is the slowest deck, absolutely, even when it's played slowly. And then even when you're playing sort of the mid-range version, you can go for something that's more linear, or you can go for baited hook. And so these are, I think, the two cards that have sort of like spawned different variants of Victor to mess around with for now. Time Warp in particular is part of the Miracle Victor sort of build that's popping up here and there, and Baited Hook is part of Hook Victor. There is sort of a Time Warpless version of the spell, like the blue spell Victor, which I suspect will become much stronger after Spirit Forge comes out, because there are cards that you want to play on the opponent's turn. We're going to see what that looks like. And there's probably going to be a version that's going to include like Blue Jace and the new Vanguard gear. So the two sort of variants, really, sort of like Miracle Victor versus like Go Wide Victor, I think will privilege Victor Leader in most cases, while the spell version is going to use Victor Innovator. So it will turn cards like Stupefy into sort of like +1 recruit, and it'll give a lot of versatility to your strategy. And in that case, the recruits are more like extra value than they are your full game plan. And those decks are going to tend to play an enormous amount of removal, like multiple singularities, Falling Comet, on top of the other suite of removal, and it plays like a more controlling deck for sure. So keep that in mind, and I'll show you a couple of lists so you can decide what you prefer. Okay, the budget version of this deck, and I honestly do recommend it, especially if you're watching this as a first-time player. Just get the Victor Champion deck. It's not that complicated. It's not terrible. It certainly is lacking the yellow Victor, which you would have to invest in, but it's a reasonable deck to get, and it'll teach you the game, and I think is probably, of the 3 starter decks, the one that I would recommend the most. I think I did in my original video, like how to get into the game. And then you can move into sort of a Victor budget list. You can also just purchase the Victor budget list if you prefer. This is sort of a downgraded Victor list based on the Star City Games or the CCS. I can't remember which one's which now, because they're messed up in my brain. Sort of like core version of Victor, and it replaces things like Thousand-Tailed Watcher with Megamech, which is absolutely a downgrade, but still something that you're happy to have in there. And it replaces the seal with a couple more versions of other units like Sprite Mother to sort of just patch through that version of the deck. Now, is this deck going to run out of runes, and is it going to run a little bit less efficiently than the seal versions? Absolutely. It's like $10 more than the actual starter deck, and I think will probably play a bit smoother, but it's up to you. And the battlefields that you run, Trifarian War Camp we talked about, File Maw we talked about, and Arena's Greatest we talked about. These are sort of like your suite of go wide, punish conquests that want to retreat, and aggress a little bit more. And so effectively what you're going to look to do with this deck is to go first, either play down a Daring Poro or a Soaring Scout, and then take a battlefield next turn. If you're going second, you can do either of those, or even play a Faithful Manufacturer. And if you're playing a 2-drop, you can play sort of like your Victor token. Turn 2, you take the battlefield that is open, and you sit under it with Hidden Blade or the Blast Cone Fae, if you're getting that, or even a Consult the Past. And then you just sort of take battlefields that are open to you at any point. You make recruits, and then if you are sitting on a Grand Stratagem, you sort of force an opponent to take a battlefield with a lot of power, and then you can like Grand Stratagem back or during. Use Singularity to remove mid-sized threats. Just remember that Singularity can hit 2 units for 6 damage in base as well, but not the same unit twice. And then your Megamech is there for matches against, for example, like a Watcher or something that's at 7 power that you want to get through. And yeah, it doesn't have Accelerate, but it'll do just fine, I think, especially for like a low budget version of the deck. That's kind of it. This is like your core yellow-blue deck that plays like a lot of the staples like Stupefy, Hidden Blade, and you got Cull, and then it runs like the Victor staples of like Machine Herald and Grand Stratagem, and that's it. Like, it's really not like super controversial. Now, where things get, really more interesting for me is when you start to move into luxury space. And I'm going to be straight up with everyone. All 3 of these decks are going to include 3 of Seal of Unity. I just think it's too good for Victor to not use. Darius gets away with it in certain builds because you at least get more energy from Darius himself. But for Victor, I think the resource tax is too high. So this is the Victor Herald of the Arcane deck run by Koi Voss, I think at the Star City Games event, or it's the Charlie's card store version. This is the version that I downgraded into the budget version. So like I mentioned, it just runs 2 of Watcher and it runs 3 of Seal, and it sort of runs a little bit differently in terms of having Falling Comet, and it has a different spin to the deck. Battlefields are the same, and the sideboard is pretty toolboxy. So 2 of Salvage against Aurora decks, Shen against Kaisa decks. So for example, Shen is not going to protect from damage, but if somebody targets a unit that you're using to hold a battlefield, you can play Shen into that space and then still hold it with him, and he's a pretty good tank on his own. 1 more Imperial Decree for the Go Tall decks, Commander Ledros to especially punish Kaisa decks and Annie decks, and then 1 of Divine Judgment for the sort of the mirror where the opponent goes even wider, or for the Aurora deck to punish. Divine Judgment doesn't really punish them once the Aurora's out, but if they're at like 8 runes and you Divine Judgment them, the game's probably over because you can hold with your small units and they're not even going to be on the board. Then the second version of this is the Herald of the Arcane by Declan B. And this it's either one event or the other. They're kind of like on opposite sides of the match pool. And this is sort of the spell-heavy version. It runs Blue Victor, and it runs 2 additional Seals of Insight. It runs Echo, and it runs 2 of Time Warp. This deck is expensive, certainly. Double Time Warp is maybe one of the most expensive inclusions to add, and I would only really go for this deck if you plan on being in blue for a long time to come, and you're happy investing in the Time Warps. Notably, you can see that this deck runs way less creatures, and it runs more Consult the Past, and it will run completely like a different speed and it will try to get on points, sit there, punish opponents, and then utilize things like Echo to force some really strange plays. So a good example is if you are on 12 runes and you're sitting on 2 points and you're at like 4, you can time warp. You go down to 8 runes, and then next turn, when you score your 2 points and you're at 6, you can play Echo and call the weak, sacrificing your Echo, and then you should theoretically have enough for another time warp. Or you can like double time warp. There's a couple of things you can do. It's a really like sneaky deck in terms of how it'll find the win. And its main difference is that instead of running Arena's Greatest, it will run Dreaming Tree, and you can start targeting your own units with Hidden Blades and Retreats and Stupefies to get a lot more draw out of it. And you're going to play a lot of these spells on your opponent's turn. So completely different style. The sideboard, the Machine Herald is for go wide. The Imperial Decree is for go tall. Facebreaker is for go tall, and the salvages are for the Aurora decks. So as you might notice, this version of the deck is not really concerned with countering the Kaisa matchup, and it will just kind of try to play the more or less a very similar game plan full of removal and time warps. And then the final version, which I really love, and if you can pull it off, my hat's off to you, is the Revolution Eats Its Children by Cephalopod. Cephalopod, who was a Legends of Runeterra player that used to kick my ass in seasonal tournaments fairly regularly a couple years ago, has come up with this mono yellow version. And I'm going to be real honest, this is the version that I was running for Viktor about 2 weeks ago, and it's the version, I'm running a very similar mono yellow version of Darius right now. So I'm a big fan of this. This version effectively plays no unit above 4 might. And so you're going to be hooking your recruits or your hawks into lecturing yordles and Trifarian glory seekers and faithful manufacturers. You're going to hook those into Vanguard captains, and your Vanguard captains are going to hook into Spectral Matron to recur whatever you just sacrificed, or into Machine Heralds. It's a super consistent deck. It runs basically only 3 ofs in every slot. And it is the deck that runs Outtro to Unity, and it doesn't run Vilemont. It runs Sigil of the Storm because it is a deck that will play incredibly low on runes. Now you're going to ask, what is the use, for example, of running mono yellow over like a mix, right? And so you're going to sacrifice some of the top end of having things like Watcher or Time Warp for incredibly consistent rune draws, which are going to make your first couple of turns very predictable and very solid. And you're almost never going to run out of the capacity to play these cards. So I'm still tinkering with it, but I would strongly recommend this deck. And Cephalopod, I think, ran this deck to 4th spot in a 32-person event, which is one of the smaller events. But I consider this version like a very interesting side plan. 3 of Decree of Unity, Imperial Decree for the Go Tall matchup, 2 retreats to get more value, especially in like a Kaisa heavy matchup, and then Salvage for Aurora, which is really like the name of the game when you're yellow. I think this deck is super cool, and if you have the budget for it, I would run this myself, but I'm on like a almost this deck, but in a different legend. And like I do for my other decks, I want to talk you through the price points for this deck. So the starter and the budget are so similar that I would almost recommend just buying the singles for the budget and waiting to get them. Or if you're playing with new players, just get the starter and then you can upgrade as you go. And then the core, which is sort of like the Watcher, sort of middle of the road version, the spell version and the hook version are all here. And surprisingly, the hook version is the cheapest. This is actually why I made the hook version first, because I didn't have access to either Time Warps or Watchers, and I've grown to love it a lot more. And I moved it to Darius for the same reason, because I don't have to pay for Kaisas, and I don't have to pay for Acathian Reigns or any of that stuff. I'm going to tell you that all of these are sort of between 200 US and like 300 some US, so they're not like crazy apart. And really, if you're investing in these versions, you're investing in the Seals of Unity, you're investing in being in yellow for a while to come, and to use decks that really want Seal of Unity. And that's why I also went for Baited Hook. So That's my reasoning. But my advice to you, if you're not like racing to play these versions, is wait for restock and wait for Seal of Unity to dip. There's a risk that if one of the Seal of Unity decks does really well in the Houston tournament, that they will spike in price even more, at which point, I'm sorry. Or if Watcher or Hook or Time Warp decks do, it'll be the same. These are like high, they're almost all, I'm pretty sure actually, no, Watcher is rare, but Hook, Time Warp, and Seal are all epics, which inadvertently gates the mine product. And it makes it really hard to estimate the value of this deck. That being said, I still like Victor a lot, and I think there's a lot more space to explore. And Victor, I think, more than most heroes that are out right now, has a very strong core and is very flexible and is probably going to scale well with cards that are coming. The sort of Vanguard shield gear thing that generates 3 recruits plus Heimerdinger is coming up. I'm sure there's going to be like a blue Victor that likes to play on the opponent's turn that's going to like pop up intermittently as like a sort of different version to the Ezreal that's coming out. Victor just kind of has the sauce, and I understand people wanting to play him, and he's also part of Arcane, so he's popular from a flavor standpoint. And I would say, you can't really go wrong. With that in mind, I will also caution you that Victor has not really taken a tournament in the last couple of weeks, and that's a bit worrisome. But the meta around him can shift all the time, and Victor really is one of those decks that's trying to play to an open field more than most decks. But how you target that field is really difficult. So keep that in mind. And like I mentioned, the plan for next week, or for the rest of the week, is to talk about the meta and how you read a meta and how the meta can change around you. We've been seeing that a lot post CCS and SCG before the Houston event. And we're going to be seeing it as the Spirit Forge cards start rolling out in China in the next couple of weeks. So I think it's going to be an important topic to cover and really something to consider when you're building your collection. And then for Friday, it's Teemo time. So that's really the plan. And hopefully, if you are one of the many people who requested Victor, this has been like useful for you and some amount of new information, or at least something that helps you make choices in the kind of Victor deck that you want to play. And if I'm recommending crazy cards or non-crazy cards, feel free to tell me. The mono yellow version is certainly out there, but I'm a big fan of it, so I'm recommending, but with like an asterisk. Anyways, have a nice one, and hopefully you're gonna have a great time at the skirmish events that are coming. And if you're at Houston, well, good luck. I might be watching you on the cam.